Now, let me tell you a little story. In May of 2025, I visited Warsaw, Poland with some of my friends. And before even going there, I found out that they had a natural history museum in the city. So, naturally, being the giant dinosaur nerd that I am, I asked if we could visit, and we did. And boy, it didn't disappoint. The sheer number of species crammed into what is a very small part of this massive building was quite remarkable. But what was even more interesting was the fact that a lot of the specimens in the museum had come from a series of expeditions to one place, Mongolia. A series of expeditions that would uncover several fossils of dinosaurs known and new to science at the time, making them, for my money, some of the most successful expeditions in the history of paleontology. Now, before discussing the finds, you can't really get away from discussing the expedition and the setup of it. So, who was involved? Well, there's obviously a few names, but possibly the most important is a lady by the name of Zofia Jaworowska. Born in Poland in 1925, early life for Zofia wasn't exactly normal, as, given the time period, she grew up during World War II in a Nazi-occupied Poland. This made early education fairly hard for the young Zofia, as the Nazis banned all secondary or higher education for non-Germans in the area. This didn't stop her though, as in 1943 she began to be educated in zoology at the University of Warsaw in secret. Also around this time, she joined an organization known as the Grey Ranks, where she would learn to be a nurse. This proved to be quite helpful during the Warsaw Uprising, where Jaworowska would treat injured civilians. This isn't important to the overall story, but it's a cool side note regardless. Anyway, after the war ended, she began to specialize in paleontology after becoming interested in the field during her studies. Originally specializing in trilobites, she would expand her expertise to include both dinosaurs and ancient mammals. However, it was during these early years where she would meet another important figure in these expeditions, Roman Kozłowski. Often called the father of Polish paleontology, he taught in both France and Bolivia during the 1910s before returning home to Poland after World War I to help rebuild the Polish sciences. He would do this yet again after World War II. This included lecturing at the University of Warsaw, as well as establishing departments within the university, such as the Department of Paleontology and Paleozoology, becoming the director of the latter. It was here in 1945 that both Kozłowski and Jaworowska met, with the former being the latter's teacher. Jaworowska often credited Kozłowski with kindling her interest in the field of paleontology, and in 1961 she took over from him as the director of the department. However, they weren't done yet, as the two began formulating the idea for a series of expeditions in the 1960s. These were the aforementioned Mongolian expeditions. But why Mongolia, you might ask? Well, ever since the 20th century, Mongolia has been thought of as a fossil-bearing site, with many expeditions happening prior to the Polish ones, with the most famous being the ones run by Roy Chapman Andrews. Alongside colleagues from the American Museum of Natural History, his expeditions uncovered fossils belonging to several well-known dinosaur genera, such as Oviraptor, Velociraptor, and Protoceratops. Hearing that success, you may think people were queuing up to go visit Mongolia, but due to something known as World War II, study in the region had to be halted. After the war ended, its placement between both the USSR and China meant that in the following Cold War, Western studies were limited. Between the 1930s and 50s, many attempts were made in order to get expeditions going, but few were successful. That was until the 1960s, when the Academy of Sciences in Mongolia was established. After its formation, the Academy travelled to Warsaw as part of a meeting between representatives of academic sciences. Here, both Polish and Mongolian scientists agreed that working together was necessary to expand the field, and began planning a series of expeditions. These were completed in 1964, and the first of what would be many expeditions was led by none other than Sophia. Between 1964 and 71, 8 expeditions were run, with Sophia leading 7 of them. Leading these expeditions wouldn't be easy, however, as they would face several problems, one of which being the region itself. See, at the time, Mongolia was very sparsely populated, with a population of around 1 million. This meant that the sites were often hundreds of kilometers away from civilization, which meant the sites had to be self-sufficient. As a result, the team had to ship tons of supplies to the capital of Mongolia by rail. The supplies included 20 pickaxes, 50 paintbrushes, 2 tons of plaster, and 14,000 litres of petrol. With the supplies in Mongolia, it didn't take long for the expedition to find fossils, with the earliest finds consisting of fish, crocodilians, and the theropod called Tarbosaurus. This early success was a sign of things to come, as future expeditions not only uncovered more Tarbosaurus remains, but also the remains of sauropods, a pair of mysterious giant arms, and one of the most famous fossils in paleontology, all of which we'll talk about later. This success was seen in the sheer number of fossils sent back to Poland, with 35 tons worth of material sent back over the first few digs. This success didn't come without its challenges. Stories of hardships faced by the team are commonplace. For example, in the first wave of expeditions, many of the crew's tents were destroyed by harsh sandstorms. As you can imagine, this hampered the digs, but these also weren't without difficulties. On one particular dig, the team uncovered the massive sauropod skeleton I mentioned earlier. But due to where the fossil was located, the team's trucks couldn't actually reach it. So, working around this, the team had to wrap the bones in plaster and drag them to the trucks on makeshift sleds. Unfortunately, the team wasn't this lucky all of the time. At one particular dig, the scientists uncovered a massive 14-meter-long specimen of Tarbosaurus. But during transportation, the only available truck broke down. With no other way to move the skeleton, a large portion of it was left behind, with only a hind limb and partial pelvis making it back. Now, while these problems all focus on equipment failures, the expedition wasn't without its risk to humans. On the final expedition, none other than Jaworowska herself suffered a ruptured eardrum during one of the aforementioned sandstorms. Understandably, this put her out of action, and she returned to Poland. But not to be kept down for long, she returned just 3 weeks later to Mongolia to continue uncovering more fossils. So, what became of the fossils when they were uncovered? Well, in the beginning, the fossils were put on show in a display set up by Jaworowska titled Dinosaurs of the Gobi, which was open until 1984. The closure of this exhibit made room for a new permanent museum opening that same year at the Palace of Culture and Sciences in Warsaw. Since then, the museum has grown to include not only the finds from the expedition, but also Triassic reptiles, models of early human ancestors, and an entire hall dedicated to marine life. If you're ever in the city of Warsaw, I would definitely recommend you check it out. So now I've got all that background information out of the way, it's time to talk about the finds and what they can tell us about the region. Well, firstly, let's take a look at what the region would have looked like at the time when these animals were alive. During the expeditions, 2 sites of interest were identified: the Nemegt Basin and the Flaming Cliffs, both of which date to the late Cretaceous some 71 to 75 million years ago. At this time, the area was very different to how it is today. In contrast to the deserts of the modern day, ancient Mongolia was a semi-arid, sometimes wet environment. We know this by the presence of an alluvial fan, which is created when loose clay and other minerals are deposited from a narrow space into an open one, usually by a river, creating a fan. As well as this, the sites have evidence of sediments that were deposited by both rivers and wind, showing us that there was both a wet and dry season. As for the flora of the site, petrified wood found here shows that the canopies were dominated by conifer trees, which would have fed the many herbivores of the area. One such herbivore was the mysterious genus Deinocheirus. For ages, this genus was only known from a pair of massive arms discovered in 1965. And when I say massive, I mean massive, as both arms measured 2.5 meters long. Due to their massive size and lack of any other fossil material, it made it hard to tell what dinosaur they belonged to. Originally, it was believed to be a carnosaur, a group of dinosaurs that usually includes Allosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus. However, the arms also had similarities with Ornithomimosaurs, a very common group that is found in the region. Fortunately, this confusion was eventually cleared up. It just took 50 years to do so. In 2011, more fossil material was found in Europe of all places. However, it wasn't dug up, but it was found in a private collection. See, this material had been dug up in Mongolia, but over the years it had been moved around multiple places before ending up in the private collection. Consisting of a skull, some vertebra with tall neural spines, a femur, a tibia, and a foot, the bones showed us that this animal was even more strange than the arms would have suggested. With this extra material, it was confirmed that Deinocheirus was an Ornithomimosaur. However, instead of being slender-built like the other Ornithomimosaur from the region, Gallimimus, Deinocheirus was 11 meters long and weighed over 13,000 pounds. Not exactly your typical Ornithomimosaur. This unique shape and size made Deinocheirus the namesake for a new family within the clade named Deinocheiridae, a family of Ornithomimosaurs noted for having more heavily built frames that includes other genera such as Garudamimus and Beishanlong. The heavy build is present for all members, but Deinocheirus has a couple unique features. For instance, the jaws of this animal may make you think of modern-day ducks. And you wouldn't be wrong for thinking that, as studies on the jaws showed that this animal had a weak bite force and meant that it likely fed on soft vegetation, such as water plants, similar to what ducks feed on today. Plants weren't all that this animal fed on, as preserved stomach contents show that not only does this animal have gastroliths, stones that are swallowed by animals to help grind up plant material, but also scales of fish, meaning that Deinocheirus was an omnivore. The presence of fish scales in this animal's stomach also tells us that this animal was spending at least some time in the water, probably using its immense size to wade out into rivers to sift through the river plants. And that's another thing that's very interesting about this animal, its immense size, which makes Deinocheirus the largest Ornithomimosaur ever discovered. This size has been theorized to help the animal reduce its chances of being predated. I mean, would you want to go after something that big? This means though that Deinocheirus had to give up the running adaptations seen in the majority of its relatives. But annoyingly, even though it was meant to help reduce predation, it didn't work all the time. Gastralia, the so-called belly ribs that belong to this animal, have been found with preserved bite marks on them. These bite marks show no evidence of healing, meaning these were inflicted on the animal after it died or shortly before the animal died, showing us that indeed this animal was preyed and fed upon. What creature could have possibly taken down a 6-ton animal? Well, none other than the largest carnivore from the formation, Tarbosaurus. Often nicknamed the Asian Tyrannosaurus rex, this creature was well known to science long before the Polish expeditions, being uncovered in the 1940s. It's given the nickname I mentioned earlier for a good reason, as when it was first uncovered, it was believed to be a species of Tyrannosaurus, being named Tyrannosaurus bata. Later, it was realized that this 12-meter-long animal belonged to its own genus and was given the name Tarbosaurus, meaning alarming lizard. This was based mainly on differences seen in their skulls, such as the fact that Tarbosaurus has a longer skull and has more teeth than T-Rex. The differences are theorized to have come from the fact that the two were likely feeding on different prey, with Tarbosaurus mainly tackling sauropods and hadrosaurs, and T-Rex feeding on ceratopsians. Despite the differences, like T-Rex, Tarbosaurus was a fearsome predator built to tackle its chosen prey. Scans of its brain showed that not only does Tarbosaurus have a great sense of hearing, likely used for communication, but also a well-developed sense of smell used to help the animal sniff out certain prey and the chemical traces used to find them. Alongside this, the animal also had a very good sense of sight, aided by mobile eyes that pointed slightly forward. Not to the extent seen in T-Rex, but for me personally, their eyes pointing that far forward has always kind of unsettled me. Back to Tarbosaurus, these adaptations would have helped it to take down the many large herbivores of the Nemegd, but some herbivores may have been too big for even Tarbosaurus to handle. One such creature, or creatures, were the enormous sauropods Opisthoscelocordia and Nemegtosaurus. Now, if my choice of words there was confusing, then let me explain. During the expedition, these two dinosaurs were uncovered in the same month, with Opisthoscelocordia consisting of a nearly complete postcranial skeleton, minus the head and neck, and Nemegtosaurus consisting of a nearly complete skull. Because of the lack of any crossover material, it has been theorized that the two are actually the same animal. Unfortunately, the very reason the theory exists is also the reason we can't prove it, as due to there being no crossover material for the two, we can't say for certain that they are the same species. That was until 2018, when a paper was published that described more fossil material found from the original Nemegtosaurus site. This extra material consisted of a femur and, more importantly, some neck vertebrae. These were important because they showed similarities to the vertebrae found in Opisthoscelocordia, most notably the connection between the bones, which formed a sort of ball and socket joint similar to those seen in Opisthoscelocordia. So this means that surely the mystery is solved. They're the same species, right? Well, no, because as I mentioned, Opisthoscelocordia wasn't actually found with any neck vertebra, so we can't compare the two. Also, the fossil material found is considered to be non-diagnostic for sauropods. So the mystery unfortunately continues. What we can say for certain is that these two giants were closely related, maybe even being sister taxa. But it's not just the giants from this region that have produced some incredible fossils. In fact, one of the most famous finds from the site is of two of the smaller dinosaurs from it. Now, if you've been interested in paleontology for some time, then you've surely come across the fighting dinosaurs specimen, a fossil that depicts a velociraptor locked in combat with a protoceratops. Well, yeah, as if these expeditions couldn't get even more awesome, they also uncovered this famous specimen. The year was 1971, and the team uncovered what they thought to be another specimen of protoceratops, with them uncovering a large portion of the body. It wasn't until they dug a little deeper that they uncovered not only the nearly complete specimen of protoceratops, with only the forelimbs, majority of the head and end of the tail missing, but also the fully complete skeleton of a velociraptor. Now, that by itself is noteworthy, but what was even better was that it was fairly obvious from the position of the two that they had been locked in a fight right before death. See, the velociraptor's right arm is trapped within the beak of the Protoceratops. Alongside this, the predator's left arm appears to be clawing at the face of its prey, and the famous sickle claw on its left leg was pointed straight into the Protoceratops's throat. Now, if all that sounds bad, don't worry, the Protoceratops didn't go down without a fight, as not only does it have the velociraptor's arm trapped within its beak, but it also appears to have collapsed on the velociraptor, pinning it beneath it. How these two ended up in this position has been of some contention. It was obvious that they had died fighting, but what did the final blow was unclear. Originally in the 1970s, it was theorized that the two fell into water of some kind, most likely a river, and were buried at the bottom. However, looking at the sediment these two were buried in told scientists that it likely wasn't deposited by water, but instead by wind. So, with the water idea out of the picture and them knowing that they were buried by wind, how did they end up here? Well, several ideas were made over the following years, such as they were buried at separate times, which is silly considering they're literally interlocked, that they were covered by a collapsing sandbank, or that they were buried in a sandstorm. Now, while those last two theories do sound likely considering where they live, they both fail to account for one fact. The fact that the Protoceratops fossil is missing quite a few parts. So to counteract that, a theory was published that states the two died long before being buried, resulting in scavengers picking apart the Protoceratops skeleton. Now, why is the Velociraptor so intact? Well, they suggest that the Velociraptor was buried first because it was pinned underneath the Protoceratops, which meant that scavengers couldn't actually get to it. And that's good news for us, as due to the perfect preservation, we were able to learn a lot about this animal, such as what raptors use their iconic sickle claw for. This modified second digit was made famous by John Ostrom's 1969 description of Deinocheirus, where he described it as being used to disembowel its prey. Small problem was that the claw itself was rather dull along its edge, which had no way of self-sharpening. The skin where these animals would have used their claws was rather thick and would have been difficult to cut, and the actual behaviour of disemboweling isn't actually well known in modern ratites, which is what Ostrom cited as his inspiration for the idea. In fact, this disemboweling behaviour in ratites is more likely the result of the weight behind the kick rather than the sharpness of the claw itself. So yeah, not a lot going for this idea. The actual function of this claw is seen quite nicely in the fighting dinosaur specimen though, where the left sickle claw is positioned in the Protoceratops's throat. This position is reminiscent of a piercing and holding position. This is consistent with the behaviour seen in animals with similar claw shapes, such as modern birds of prey that use their claws to hold their prey in place. Also, with the claw being hook-shaped, I'm surprised no one suggested that it probably was pretty bad at cutting. Anyway, this gave rise to the raptor-prey restraint idea. The idea that Velociraptor and its relatives used their claws to hook onto prey and pin them down, whilst using their feathery tails and wings to maintain balance as the prey struggled. Unfortunately for this individual though, it didn't work out. But that is fortunate for us though, as it meant that these two got to be preserved for all the world to see. Truly an amazing specimen, one of many uncovered during some of the most successful expeditions in paleontology, and from one of the most fascinating fossil sites in the world. But it isn't the only site that preserves amazing dinosaur remains, and if you want to learn about another, then click the video on the screen. Until next time, bye bye.